Okay, we are live. So, welcome everyone to what is now episode 83 of the podcast. We're getting up there. Today, we actually have someone who's new to this podcast, and we'll introduce him briefly. Just in terms of announcements, we have a few interesting episodes forthcoming sometime this month. Alma Alwell will be on to discuss his theory about the priesthood and temple restrictions and why they lasted for so long. Also, Stephen Harper will be on next month to discuss the history and development of the word of wisdom, something we were just joking about earlier. And 2 weeks after that, Trent Stevens will be on to discuss his book on science and the Old Testament, as well as his currently forthcoming book on science, scripture, and the flood of Noah. We also have some other episodes in the can. For instance, Derek Salisbury will be on at the end of this month to discuss his work on Joseph Smith's presidential campaign in 1844. So we actually have a fun number of things forthcoming. So as I said, today we will be actually having an episode that will be touching upon a number of topics. As you know, sadly, President Nelson passed away recently, and he will be succeeded soon by Dallin H. Oaks. So I thought it would be a good idea to have an episode discussing the teachings of both these men. But also, our guest also has a background in the church when it comes to, say, its Middle Eastern history and context, as well as playing a role in the current or the new Arabic translation of the Book of Mormon. So we'll actually have a number of topics we'll be discussing today, not just one or two. But as I said, Jabra, you're new to this podcast, so how about you just introduce yourself? Like, what's your education? What's your history in respect to the church, and any other details you wish to share?
Yeah, sure. So thank you. I really appreciate this and sounds like an amazing list of topics. So I'll make sure to watch. So my name is Jabra and the last name is Ghneim. So what's the name? Ghneim. I was actually the first Jordanian to join the church in the Middle East. First Jordanian to join the church in Jordan, actually, I have to say. I don't know about the whole Middle East, but I'm pretty sure I was, but because of the legal restrictions at the time. But I was the first to be baptized in Jordan. That was back so I learned about the church in 1988 through a neighbor who is also Jordanian, who was going to BYU, and we met for a few hours, and he taught me, actually it was like a whole night, and he taught me about the gospel. He shows up at my door with a missionary discussion set and started teaching me. I was going to church with his family who were Baptist, and I had a lot of questions. And by 2 in the morning, I knew the church was true, but I was hoping to go with him next day to sacrament meeting, but the government had restrictions. I had to wait 2 years until it was May of 1990. He shows up in Jordan again, and he tells me that Christians, because that's my background, my family is from Bethlehem, and they were, Greek Orthodox with some crypto Jewish background, and so I was Christian, and he said Christians can go to the church and can, ask to be taught and can ask to be baptized. So yeah, that's what I did. And thanks to President Nelson, actually, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but he played a key role in this by allowing the church to get that permission in Jordan. So yeah, I joined the church, came to BYU, did my master's degree in economics, and then went back to the Middle East to start working with the church publishing services department as a translator. So we had in those days, so when the church goes into a country, you have something called a phase one material. And phase one material is basically the articles of faith, selections from scripture, the testimony of Joseph Smith, sacrament prayers in Arabic, and those were already done, but they needed to do the phase two curriculum, which consisted of about 5,000 pages of basic manuals and other administrative documents. So I was tasked with that, finished it. I moved to Dubai in 98. I was managing editor of several technology magazines there, like Pan Arab magazines, and was there for about 4 almost 3 years until September 11th happened. By the time I was married to my wife, who's from the US, and we were living there, and the situation became hard. So we decided to come back to the US, and I've been here since then. So when I came back, I resumed my translation role with the church, and basically, which is translating conference, general conference, translating more material. So, you have the Preach My Gospel curriculum and all the Sunday school material. Basically, everything, if you go to the church's website and go to Arabic, some people will find that hard to believe because I'm just one man, but I work with a team of other editors. But everything there is either translated directly by me or edited or reviewed, or I've had a hand in like almost all of those publications. So in 2012, they were looking into finally retranslating the Arabic Book of Mormon. And at the time, I've just been accepted at the PhD program at BYU in the Department of Education. And so I was doing my PhD, and I was chosen to be the one to do the translation of the Book of Mormon into Arabic. Of course, when you translate, you're working with content and language reviewers. So I had a couple other people helping with the project and reviews, and finished that in 2018, and then started with the Doctrine and Covenants, which is yet to be published. Just for your viewers, translating the scriptures specifically takes about 10 to 15 years, because once the translator is done with it, the translation goes to what's called an ecclesiastical review committee, which consists of members living in the area, and they're sort of like a quality control team that looks at the translation and then sends feedback, and based on that feedback, the final translation is shaped. And that's what's just happened. The church just published the full translation of the Arabic Book of Mormon online. So if you have friends or people who ask you to share the Arabic Book of Mormon, now it's available online. You can share it through the Book of Mormon app or through the church app. You just go and switch the language to Arabic, and there it will be. And I've just finished this week interpreting for my 60th conference with the church. I started in 1994, and your viewers might not recognize the name or its significance, but my very first talk to interpret was Elder Neil A. Maxwell. I was still green in interpretation. So imagine walking into a booth and someone says, Elder Maxwell is speaking next, and you don't have any copy of the talk, you don't even see it, and you're expected to interpret it like as he speaks. And I keep telling people, newbies, new interpretation newbies, I keep telling them, there is no way to know failure like being in that situation, So yeah, but then since then I've interpreted for all the brethren, and yeah, it's been quite a ride. But yeah, so finished my PhD in education, still working for the church, doing these kind of events and doing translating material, and that. So that's basically my background.
Okay, that's pretty comprehensive. Thanks for that. So, um, what we'll do is like maybe like the first section, like you can share like some of your thoughts on like say the doctrine and other aspects of talks that you're familiar with from President Nelson, and then we can go on to like you can then share your thoughts on Dallin H. Oaks, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah. So with President Nelson, it's really interesting. So it's right after he passed away, the Salt Lake Tribune, which, as you and your audience knows, is not very friendly to the church. Even their compliments are always like backhanded compliments. I read something on their page that said that President Nelson was as an apostle was not a trailblazer or something to that effect. And it really made me furious, but I was too busy with translating for conference to actually care and write a response to that, because President Nelson is everything but he is the trailblazer. He was, but his leadership style has always been quiet, and he tries not to make waves. I mean, the consequences of his actions were very significant. For example, in my case, President Nelson was, when I first saw him in Jordan, he was a new apostle. He was probably 4 or 5 years on the job, and single-handedly, the church has been trying to get into any country of the Middle East since the late 70s. And they were not successful. And Elder Nelson comes in to Jordan, and he just starts making all of these visits with the officials and people in the Jordanian government. And not only he manages to secure recognition for I wouldn't say it was a full recognition of the church, but it basically allowed the church to have a foothold in a Muslim country and actually teach the Christians of that country. And he did it with a mix of diplomacy, practicality, and he was an amazing networker. And he also had this personality. You just kind of like him instantly when you see him. At least that's what Jordanian officials I talked to later told me about him. They just liked him, and they basically allowed the church to operate in Jordan. And that's why I'm here. I'm grateful for what he did in Jordan. But then you look at President Nelson's history throughout the 80s. He was always coming in and out of the Middle East, going to Europe, some different parts of Europe. I think there were a couple of times when he went to Asia. But when the Berlin Wall fell, we already had, because of him, because of his role as an apostle, and I learned much later that was something that I think it was President Benson. It was President Benson, but he just went ahead with it. And because of him, many people talk about, for example, the temple in East Germany or the temple in Hong Kong. Those temples were made possible because of President Nelson's, diplomatic, outreach, the kind of person he was, the contacts he had because of his role as a, world-renowned surgeon. He managed to get us those temples at a time when it was unfathomable that we would have a temple in East Germany. The communists were cracking down on any religious expression, and here comes this man who gets a temple in East Germany. So President Nelson was very, very good like that. Now, doctrinally, something that always struck me about him, every time I translated something by him, it was very interesting to me how organized his thinking doctrinally was. So he would focus on the basics. He would focus on the basic doctrine. The centrality of Jesus Christ and his teachings, trusting in the Lord. I've written some notes down, and so I'm going to just read the headlines. Role of opposition and divine help. It's all of these things were just basic to him. I mean, right before he became the prophet, I don't know if you remember this talk, but it was about the Book of Mormon, the things that he learned from the Book of Mormon. And you look at that list he put together in that talk, and it's brilliant. It was brilliant. It focuses on all the things that the Book of Mormon provides, the doctrine, the things that distinguish us as a church, the restoration, and the doctrine that were restored through the Book of Mormon. I use the list when someone asks me about the Book of Mormon. I pull up the list and I look at it and I say, and I start my discussion there. So he was a man who had who knew how to streamline things, organize things, including the teaching the basic doctrine of the church. And that's why if you're not involved in the church much, or if you're not someone who's followed General Conference a lot, or if you're someone, I don't know, when you watch President Nelson, you always thought, oh, he's teaching, you're teaching the same old thing. But he was always teaching the basic doctrine, because in the end, that's what we need to be focused on. One thing that's interesting about President Nelson is, and again, going back to that whole trailblazer comment that was made, many people, and I don't know, did you know that he was the Sunday school general president in the 70s? Yeah.
Go ahead. Go figure. Never knew that.
Yeah, he was the Sunday school general president, I think from 77 or from 74 to 97, something like that. But for about 7 years in the 70s, he was the general president of the Sunday school. Now, before him, so I track the church curriculum across the ages. This is one of the things I've always done. It's a part of my work, and just to see how things develop. And in the past, people would publish a book. Someone would decide that this book will be for example, the curriculum for instruction in Sunday school or priesthood or Relief Society. Hugh Nibley, for example, had a couple of books and they were taught in Sunday school in that era. So President Nelson comes into the Sunday school presidency. He's the president of the Sunday school. And he's like, we're done with all of this. And he restructures the whole curriculum of the church. And he says, we need unified curriculum for the church. And that's where that 4-year cycle we've been following then, which was culminated in Come Follow Me, started. It started in 1977 when he said we will standardize the curriculum. And so if you're growing up in the church in the early 80s, or like me, came into the church in the late 80s, you had Sunday school, an elders quorum priesthood manual. You had a Relief Society priesthood manual that discussed either, whatever scripture we were studying that year. And then you had an organized Sunday school curriculum. You had curriculum for young men, young women. All of that whole program started with President Nelson. So people nowadays talk about the Come Follow Me program as it is, oh, wow, he thought about this just now. He comes in and all of a sudden this Come Follow Me program comes out of nowhere. But this Come Follow Me program is the culmination of his thinking about Sunday school instruction going way back to the 70s. And so his fingerprints are in so many things that we do in the church, but he was a quiet man who expressed things quietly without making waves, as opposed to someone like Bruce R. McConkie. I mean, you listen to, and it's just something in the style, right? You listen to someone like Bruce R. McConkie, even if he's talking about the most mundane subjects, you feel fire and brimstone, right? So I mean, I used to, every year I listen to one of the prophets, and I try to listen to every single talk and every single thing they've written. And one year I would take Elder McConkie with me on my walks, and I would listen to him. And I kid you not, sometimes you finish, you're like, oh my gosh, I need to be doing better. Um, I'm failing as a member of the church, but that was Elder McConkie. You listen to President Benson, and as early in the church, early in my membership in the church, and again, he had a certain style and a certain manner of expression, and he was very authoritative, and you were drawn to that, but it also left you with very strong impressions. President Nelson is kind of the quiet spoken, just matter of fact, I don't know, like as a surgeon, probably he learned how to be very controlled and manages himself different. But you listen to him, and even when you're interpreting for him in the booth, he is very deliberate in the way he says things. Even up to his last talk, last conference in April, you listen to him, and he is very, very controlled in a situation where he couldn't read well. He needed to use a special machine to be able to read the talk. But you would never be able to tell, because he was that kind of person. So yeah, he was just an incredible person. And you look at the how things happened after COVID. I mean, we needed that kind of calm, assuring presence and President Nelson. And this is one of the things that make me know that the Lord sends, the people he needs for certain moments in church history, no matter how short. I remember, for example, President Hunter. Um, he was a special man, and I wish we've seen more of him. But let me just share with you and your audience an anecdote. It's not an anecdote, it's a story. So I was at conference, not conference, at the Marriott Center at BYU in 1993, when he gave the famous talk where the famous incident happened, where some lunatic rushes to the podium, stands there with a suitcase and says there is a bomb in there. And he wanted Elder Hunter at the time, or President Hunter at the time, because he was president of the Quorum of the 12, he wanted him to read a statement. And we were all watching this frail old man, sitting there in his wheelchair. And, assumingly there is a bomb next to him. And I forget what his name was, Cody Jody or something like that, like threatening him. And President Hunter just didn't even say a word. He was just shaking his head no, in all calmness. And then the audience, rushed to the stand and kind of saved the day. But he was just a calm man. And then later on, I've talked to people who've visited with him, some Jordanians who were familiar with him, because President Hunter would visit the Middle East quite often, because he was a part of the whole Jerusalem Center thing. And people would share with you these stories about how kind and calm and effective he was. And it's just the kind of people that the Lord gives us. President Nelson was like that. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble. So that's President Nelson for you.
Well, that's fun. And what about President Oaks and any of your thoughts based on translating, often on the cuff of
Yes.
his talks?
Yeah. So whereas President Nelson is the structured, simple doctrine, focus on the basic doctrine, we get to President Oaks. And President Oaks, I always make sure that I translate him, because the way his arguments are prepared, it is like you're reading a legal brief. It's apologetics at its best. He states the case, he states the proof, he reiterates it, and he presents it like he's presenting a legal brief. I kept a few notes, actually. So let me just share with you a couple of things I've written about him, if I can scroll down to it in time without wasting too much time. But President Oaks is also one of those people. He's very invested in, as as you've seen in this last conference, the plan of salvation. I think the message at least for the last 10 years, President Oaks's message to us has been the plan of salvation, where we were, always reminding us where we've been, where we come from, reminding us why we're here and what we need to do, and then talking about our eternal destiny and the role of the family in all of that. I think of all the brethren, I'd say President Oaks is the best voice right now against all of this moral relativism that's happening in society. he gives clarity to the gospel. There is a lot of clarity in his talks. There is a lot of basic gospel principles that have to do with the plan of salvation and the centrality of the family. And I think that's going to be one of the themes of his presidency. I don't know the form it will manifest in. My hunch says there will be more focus on temple attendance, more focus on going, making sure that we're living the gospel as families. But I don't know how it will manifest. And then the second part, and I think it's very, very important for his presidency, will be the focus on religious freedom. And I have to admit to you here, when the whole topic of religious freedom came up, I was like, I mean, because I'm not a legal person, I'm not a lawyer, I wasn't trained legally in legal matters, but I was like, the United States and Europe have religious freedom. I mean, I can, practice the religion I want, I can believe how I want, so there are no problems here. But this was a few years ago, and boy, I was wrong. So this week, after general conference, every October, there is a legal symposium on law and religion at BYU, and I go and I interpret that. And it's really interesting. It's always about religious freedom. It's something that BYU is very invested in. They've been doing it for 32 years. And the last couple of years have been kind of shocking to me. So the day before yesterday, a gentleman from Australia gave a presentation about this new law that they are proposing in Australia. And kid you not, I'm going to try and be because, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't explain it in legal terms. But as an interpreter, I have to understand it in very simple ways so that I can explain it to the people listening. So there is a law in Australia. And what this law says is that you can, if you go online, and I kid you not, this is not an exaggeration, and you post a verse from the Bible, random verse, it doesn't have to do with homosexuality, it doesn't have to do with controversial topics, but let's say you post something like, I'm the truth, the way, and the life, and someone reads that and says, I'm offended, this is hate speech and it endangers me. They can take you to court in Australia for hate speech. And if a reasonable person, and I kid you not again, there is no definition for who a reasonable person is. I'm sure one should be forthcoming. But if a reasonable person says, yes, I feel the same way too about this verse from the Bible, then you are sent to jail and fined for that. And I just was flabbergasted listening to this.
It's actually the same in England as well these days.
I know when he talked about it. So we had a bunch of people from England. John Holt was there, and he confirmed it. And I almost gasped in the microphone, because whenever I heard that stuff on social media, I was like, fake news, people trying to make something out of nothing. And I just couldn't believe it. But this is where we're headed to. And so to me, that gave more meaning to the presidency of Dallin H. Oaks, because we need his wisdom on that. And it turns out, like, when the proclamation of the family came out, I was back in the Middle East, and I remember thinking, why is the church talking about things that are so common sense? I mean, to us in the Middle East, family is everything. Father and mother, male and female, these things are basics. But then as the years went by, you realize, oh my goodness, they foresaw this. They could see it, and they had the sense of danger that this represents. And the church has been talking about religious freedom for so many years. And I always wondered, but then the events since COVID, specifically with freedom of speech and expression, and culminating with the knowledge I had this week about these laws in Australia and now England, it's been interesting to me. So we live in an age that requires someone like President Oaks. I don't know how long he'll live. I don't know how long he'll be president of the church, but I hope he is alive long enough. I'm sure the Lord put him there for a reason, and I'm sure he's alive long enough to help us tackle that. But that's been one of the things that he's been, of all the brethren, like in his talks, religious freedom has been one of the key themes. Religious freedom, plan of salvation, family. I mean, these are the things that I believe we'll see come out in some one form or another in his presidency, because he's been talking about it for a long time. I mean, President Nelson was talking about the name of the church back in the early 2000s. There is a talk. Again, I should have pulled these up, but I remember them because I translated and interpreted them, but I can't remember which conference. But he talked about that in the early 2000s. So these things have been in their minds. They will manifest in their presidency somehow. We don't know how, but they will. I promise you they will. And they will be a huge focus. So yeah, so that's President Oaks. One thing about President Oaks is that he is, I've started reading one of his books a couple of nights ago, Things of the Heart, or With Full Purpose of Heart. I forgot the name of the book, even though I'm still reading it.
With full purpose of heart, like his previous sermons. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I read that recently as well.
yeah, it strikes me. I mean, all of these themes were just coming up in the book, and I think they will be the theme of his presidency. So yeah, so that's President Oaks for you. These are and again, interpreting him is like interpreting for a lawyer, and I've done my fair of that. He's he's a lawyer at heart. So one thing we'll probably see from him, he talked about it during the funeral services about how President Nelson was the decisive type of person, because when someone is laying in front of you open, you don't have the luxury of deliberating or consulting. And so he made decisions, quickly. Well, quickly is the wrong word, decisively. He was decisive about it. And I think President Oaks will bring to the church back, like he's going to think about things a little bit, and he's going to consult, and he's going to deliberate, and he's going to hear opinions about it. So probably like organizational changes. I don't know. It might that might change, but I don't think we will see quick, rapid changes like we've seen with President Nelson.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. I really do appreciate it. So, two of the other topics we'll be discussing will be the history and background of the church in the Middle East, including your native Jordan, but also the modern Arabic translation of the Book of Mormon. So, I'll let you pick whichever one you want to discuss first, and then I'll let you take it from there.
Sure. Let's talk about the history of the church in the Middle East. So, as you know, you have Orson Hyde going back to the Middle East. You have many of the brethren go back to the Middle East, going back to the 1840s. So the church in the Middle East isn't a new thing, which I've always found fascinating, because, I mean, and this is a question I haven't had an answer for, what would make Joseph Smith, what would make Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff and all these people send people to the Ottoman Empire to preach the gospel? And I have to say, we've made some progress, but not much progress since those days in terms of the native membership. I mean, native membership is just, less than 300 probably, most of them inactive. But we have healthy, small branches in Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt who have native members. And we've sent, like from Jordan, we have 3 branches, and we've sent many missionaries from them, who most of whom went back to Jordan. So, it's very challenging for the church in the Middle East. It always has been challenging, because number one, there is Islam, there is the problem of conversion laws. Islam built into it is that the fact that, I mean, this is not something that if you kill someone for changing their religion in Jordan, for example, you'll surely go to jail and you'll be punished. But it gives license, the existence of that law in Islam gives license for people to do some crazy things. So that's been a challenge. And the church, by its nature, has always been very conservative about the Middle East. So for example, in Lebanon, and I don't know if you know much of this history, but in Lebanon until the early 70s, we had several wards, and we almost had a stake in there, consisting mostly of Armenian Lebanese people. And the civil war happens, and I've seen this happen in my own life with the church. The church immediately pulls out, freezes everything, and it's like the last 50, 60 years of investment in that effort, just meant nothing, right? It's unfortunate to say that, and I don't want this to be interpreted as a critique or a criticism, but this is the fact that I've seen. This is how I feel it is. Maybe it's not intended like that, but that's how it always happens. So, for example, in Jordan, back in the early 90s, we had several branches. And between the three branches, we had about 500 people. Many of them were actually refugees from Iraq. And we were baptizing, and many people were joining the church, and it was just a great period of time. And the church leadership made some investments, like in translation. We moved to phase 2. They made sure we had material. We had our own channel for general conference, which we still have and we still broadcast. But the church doesn't push hard. I don't know how to the words to express this appropriately, but for example, in Jordan, President Nelson comes in the late 80s, and he strikes this agreement with the Jordanian government. And it's basically an agreement based on some mutual interest. The ambassador from Jordan to Washington is Senator Mohammed Kamal. He visits the BYU campus. He loves his experience there so much. He says, I want Jordanian students to come here. So the church jumps on the opportunity and says, okay, if you want them to come here, we will need a center for BYU to be able to interview those students and recommend them to the university. So that's how the BYU Center for Cultural and Educational Affairs was born. And a part of the tasks of that center was to be a place where members of the church can meet. And President Nelson basically gets from the Jordanian government permission to teach Christians only if they go and ask to be taught and to be baptized. So that's how it happened. And we start getting all of these Jordanian students, and we send them to BYU. We make huge investments in those students because we give them scholarships. So they come to BYU for free. And then the idea is you send them back to the Middle East, and you're building this network of friends. And so, like, the church, it's a great idea. It's, when I think of, when I, there is an interesting book about Vatican spies and the Vatican having its own, like, CIA type of agency. I think of the church sometimes doing things like that as, okay, here is how we're going to infiltrate into a country. Here's how we're going to establish a foothold. And we established this great program. So this was 40 years ago almost. And since then, hundreds and hundreds of Jordanian and Arab students have come to BYU. But throughout that time, the church has struggled to expand our rights. So in Jordan, like in most Muslim countries that have Christians in it, you have to be one of the religions that are mentioned in the constitution. So in Jordan, they have the Armenian Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Anglican Church, and one more church that I forget. Anyway, so these are the 5 churches that are approved in the Jordanian constitution. And people who belong to those churches can get married in those churches, can get buried by, pastors in those churches. And they have, all the religious rights. In the Middle East, by the way, and I think it was both a colonial British law and an Ottoman law called the Tanzimat. Basically, each religious denomination has its own religious courts to manage civil affairs. So we don't have state marriages. You don't walk into a state office and sign a marriage certificate and you're married. You have to actually go get married in a church or a religious institution. When you die, the church or the religious institution divides your inheritance, and they are the ones who bury you in a cemetery lot that belongs to that church, etc., etc., etc. So, to be a Mormon in Jordan, you expect that the LDS Church will be able to provide you with all of these things, because if you don't have a marriage certificate, for example, if you're married by a bishop or if you're married in a temple, that certificate is not binding to the Jordanian government. To them, you're not married. And so you don't have any of the other, legal benefits. So the church works on this for decades. And a few years ago, I was here, I learned that they finally got some solution. And it is, I don't know what to think of it. Really, I get angry mostly when I think of it. But what the church decided to do is to work with the Anglican Church and include the LDS Church to be a part of the Anglican Church. So if you're a Mormon in Jordan and you want to get married, you have to go to an Anglican person to marry you. Now, and here is the dilemma of this. The dilemma of this is, the Anglican Church allows, female priests, they allow homosexual priests, they allow all kinds of things. And so, how would the church feel if someone in Jordan, if the Anglican priest in Jordan is one of those people and he's marrying members of your church? And what are the consequences of that? And when you, as a Mormon, need to get buried, you get buried in an Anglican cemetery, etc., etc., etc. So, for all purposes, Mormons are. I mean, we've put all of this effort to make sure that when you say the name of the church, you say the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to emphasize we're Christian, to emphasize we're a separate church. But in Jordan, we kind of confuse the situation by having our members being administered to by Anglicans. So that's the solution they had. In Egypt, for example, members of the church still meet in secret. I mean, they have, a cover, they have an arrangement with the government, but they cannot teach. And there is such an atmosphere of fear that, for example, many people, many Egyptians contact me online and they want a copy of the Book of Mormon. Our church in Egypt can't even give a copy of the Book of Mormon in Arabic to an Egyptian investigator who's Christian, right? And so in most countries of the Middle East now, and again, this creates like a two-tier membership in the Middle East, because if you're an Arab member, you're living in this constant fear and constant worry, and you're limited in what you can do with others. Whereas you have American, British, Australians, Aussie members, even Filipino members who come in, and there are thousands of them across the Middle East. We have stakes in the Middle East, in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, and in Saudi Arabia. And they have full privileges as members of the church, whereas the Arab members, do not. So to go to the temple, even as an Arab, and the church does great things. They have a fund that sends families to the temple in Rome, and they do all the ordinances and stuff, but it's a big deal when it happens. And hopefully when the Dubai temple gets built, that will change. But even with the Dubai temple, Right now, President Nelson announced it 5 years ago, and it was such an emotional moment for me. But it's stuck right now because the laws of the UAE are such that you have to have something called a kafil, a guarantor, if you're to live in the United Arab Emirates. And they are giving us all kinds of trouble about bringing people in on visas without a guarantor to go to the temple, especially if they're Arabs. Now, British, American, European, NATO members of the church, or members of the church whose countries are members of NATO, basically can go in and out, easily to the temple and use it. But the Arab members still have to go through all kinds of hoops to go to the temple when it gets built in Dubai because of the visa restrictions. And so, on one hand, we've made progress on many things, but on the other hand, we're still where we were back in the days when Orson Hyde was going to the Middle East. The members do not have much rights, and as a result, so we have hundreds of members enrolled in Jordan and Egypt, people who've been baptized, joined the church, who are Christian, Jordanians, Egyptians, etc. But because of all of these restrictions, we can't make them stick with the church, because there is a civil life that they have to live, and the church still doesn't provide the proper support. The Arab member in Jordan would say, I joined the LDS church because I believe in it. I want to live according to it. But then you send me to an Anglican person to perform marriage, or to bury me when I die, or to bury my loved one when I die. So why would I want to be a member when you're not giving me those rights as a member of the church? So they don't see the point, and they end up just falling by the side of the road. So that's the situation for the church in the Middle East right now. I mean, but here is one comment. The church, and because I don't want whoever listens to this to fall into the same trap that I feel, the church, organization falls for. When you think of the Middle East, you have to think of people living inside, and you have to think of all the people who are living outside. The Arab Spring in 2011 was the Berlin Wall moment for the church. Let me explain. So I was in Jordan when the Berlin Wall fell, and Elder Spencer Condi of the 70 at the time, he was kind of in charge of the portfolio over our area. And when the Berlin Wall fell, he said we were caught with our pants down on Eastern Europe, because the church was absolutely not ready for what followed next, which all the needs, all the people coming in, all the people wanting to know about religion, all the people who were willing to join the church. I mean, it was a great moment, but it took a massive change in the organization at the time. And I remember it because I was working for the church, doing the translation work. It took a huge shift in resources towards Eastern Europe. And we were there for a decade doing things to support all the members who joined the church there. Now, 2011, with the Arab Spring, and you live in Europe, so you will have a better sense of that than me. You had literally millions of Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Baha'i, Druze leaving the region, coming into Europe, and they are on the street meeting missionaries who would call me. I mean, especially in the early days, I would receive dozens of calls a week on Skype from missionaries in Europe who would call the church, hey, we need someone to interpret for us in Arabic. And they did not have anything in Arabic available, because you translate all of these things. There was, but they were either not printed, we didn't have current copies, or it wasn't available. So we went to Elder Holland at the time and we said, we need something done. And that's why they decided to put Arabic in the app. Arabic before then was a restricted language, like a top secret language. We did work, but everything we did was restricted. And so we weren't allowed to be in the app. And Elder Holland, we went and we said, Elder Holland, this is our Berlin Wall moment. We have millions of Arabs literally on the street wanting to know more about religion, and our missionaries are not there. And again, it took a huge shift in resources. We did the Arabic app, we put much material there to help the missionaries. But the point is, we weren't ready for it. I mean, to this day, and this is something I actually was surprised about this last conference, I learned that even for languages that are established in the church, like Spanish, we rely on a contracting system. Like all the work I do for the church, I've done for 34 years as a contractor, which is fine. But we do not have employees who are trained, who are there to meet those needs. Every time there is a need, we scramble, to get some company or some, service. We outsource it to that service, people who are not members, people who do not know our doctrine, to basically handle our most precious product, which are words, right? And translating for the church is more than just, you're not just translating. Way back to 1992, the church had certain standards by which the translation needs to be done. For example, it needs to be formal equivalence. For those of you in the audience who do not know what formal equivalence is, it's called modified literal translation. You have to keep the meanings of the words. You have to keep the intent of the speaker. You have to translate literally, but modify it to the needs of your language. It's an art. It's an art. The language has to sound like it was written by a native speaker. It has to appeal to them. It has to address their cultural sensitivities, etc., etc. And there is a lot of quality control that goes into this. And yet, as a church translation, we have a bunch of people managing processes who are not speakers of any of those languages and contracting it out to, teams that, come and go by. There is no investment. So we have a little problem there in that regard. And this applies even to teams like Spanish and Portuguese. I mean, someone told me that one of the brethren told them, so this is coming to you third hand, that AI does better translation. And this is one of the brethren, actually two of the brethren, one of them in the 12 and one of them in an auxiliary organization, but high up there. They said that AI provides better translation in the languages they use than the translators and interpreters they work with. And, to be honest, that shocked me. Luckily, it wasn't about Arabic, because I know the Arabic service we do is really, really good. But I was shocked. Like, you're talking about languages, FIGS languages, French, Italian, German, Spanish. And it shocked me. And then I asked why, and they said, yeah, because, the teams providing those services are very transient. They are not people who are just sitting there, receiving constant training, deliberating and talking to each other about word lists and terminology lists and, doing reviews. For example, for conference, if we had, let's say, an Arabic department that had two or three, a translation team of two or three, and believe me, that would be more than sufficient. You can sit down and after conference, and you can do a play-by-play. Okay, here is what went right, here is what went wrong, here's how we need to improve. We can't do that under the current arrangements, and that limits the church's translation work. It limits the way the message gets delivered. So we deliver it in English perfectly. We deliver it, in a good way. But as a translation, we're not there yet. And this, I believe, this is our number one product: words, doctrine, teachings. And we don't have the investment in it. And So anyway, so we want the church to think also of the millions of Arabs who are, so the Middle East has come to Europe, it has come to America. Our missionaries are meeting all of these people. So we need that kind of investment, because if you have let's say you manage to convert our missionaries in Europe out of those, millions and millions of Arabs who came out, we managed to convert, 10, 20, 30,000 Arabs work in familial units. So these people will impact their families who are back in the Middle East, and it will trickle down, that those conversions will trickle down to the Middle East, and we'll be able to strengthen and expand the church in the Middle East. And I think that's our opportunity. And so far, we haven't grasped that opportunity fully, because we still have to do a lot in the way we, I don't know, preach the gospel to these people. I mean, the brethren, the presidency of our area, the Middle East, North Africa area, are great. They, they advocate for Arabic translation, Arabic material. That they're very supportive. We're providing massive amounts of humanitarian assistance to the region. All of these are great things, but so far we haven't been able to impact the growth of the church in the region, or even outside, to all the Arabs who are out here. And many of them are Muslims. For decades, there was something called the Yellow Paper. And the Yellow Paper was an instruction that missionaries, when they encounter Muslims, you can't teach them the gospel if they are planning to go back to their countries of origin. So if you met a Muslim at BYU and they wanted to learn about the church and join it, you couldn't baptize them. But now we have all of these Muslims who are here. They're not going back. And so far I feel we still haven't realized the potential of what we can do. So anyway, was that helpful? What does about the church in the Middle East?
Oh no, that's very helpful. Thank you. And maybe
Yeah.
we can now go on to like say the Arabic translation of the Book of Mormon.
Yes.
So maybe if you were to give like your history, like say previous attempts to translate it into like Arabic, like whether by the church or like by individuals, but also there's a common misbelief or misconception that because Arabic is kind of closely related to Hebrew, like Central and Northwest Semitic languages, respectively, and because it's purportedly falsely said to be easy to translate into Hebrew, which it's not,
Yeah.
as Tretnos, if he was still alive, it can't be that difficult, to translate back into a Central Semitic language like Arabic. So if you want to, like, say, nip that in the bud and tell us, like, what were the difficulties in trying to, like, translate it while keeping, like, say, the nuances of the original intact and all that as well. So whatever else you want to discuss vis-a-vis that
Yeah.
translation.
Yeah, so that's so I have to say that's before I started translating it. That's something I've heard like way back in the 90s when I was at BYU, and people would ask me about the Book of Mormon. That's the first question. Are there things in there? Is it easier to translate or understand? Because it was written in modified Egyptian and reformed Egyptian, or whatever the term is, and did you see that? My response to them was always, no, there are some things in there that have a Semitic feel to it, things that I can understand. And, in the telling of the stories, the cultural background of the stories, yes, that is very Semitic. And some of those things really amaze me when I encounter them. But as linguistically, absolutely not. So, just the background of the history of the translation of the Book of Mormon in Arabic. Again, President Nelson. I mean, the man is a legend. So he had this neighbor. His neighbor was name was Sami Hanna. Now, all of us who've heard about President Nelson's life, we know that he loved learning languages, and so his neighbor Sami Hanna was a professor of Arabic, and he wasn't a member. And President Nelson basically met him and he said, hey, why don't you translate the Book of Mormon to Arabic? And that's how the first translation, the one that's currently printed, started. It was Sami Hanna, and then there was a guy, his name was Abdul Malik. He was his reviewer, who also wasn't a member, but they were both at BYU in some capacity, and they were President Nelson's. Sami Hanna was President Nelson's neighbor. And Sami Hanna did, to tell you the truth, his translation is a literary masterwork in Arabic. It's beautiful. Language is florid, literary, elevated, and it's beautiful. It presents the best traditions of the Arabic language. Always amazes me, and it was done, in the old way. It was written on paper, and Bill Parkinson at the time was the sort of, we call the content reviewer, not content, language reviewer. So he basically was in charge of voweling the text. So he would vowel it on some computer word processor, a very primitive one, and they printed it, and it had many typos in it, but the typos were because of the production, and once it got printed they couldn't change it, but it still remained a beautiful book, like language wise. When I read the Book of Mormon, I actually didn't read it until I was in the church a couple of years, because they couldn't get me a copy. And in those days, it was really hard to get a copy of the Arabic Book of Mormon. You had to put in a special order. Again, those restrictions I talked about. Anything that had to do with Arabic was treated with suspicion. It wasn't easily accessible. I found it delightful, but of course pointed out that it is high level Arabic that most Arabs will not be able to understand. And Sami Hanna, the translator, took literary license in the way he translated some things that kind of betrayed the doctrine of the church or made them kind of murky. So we pointed these things out, and me and a couple other people, and people sat on it for a while. And in 1994, when I started translating the Phase 2 material, and we stabilized the word list. So there is this word list for the church that you have to stabilize. You have to basically say, these are the terms, these are the things that we're going to call things like baptism. What's the word that we're going to use for faith or repentance? And believe me, those are very hard discussions, because Arabic has many words for certain concepts. So, for example, the word for prayer, is it a salah or is it a dua? And there is a difference between the two, even though both of them get translated as prayer. So anyway, so we stabilized that, and they said, okay, well, now is the time to translate the Book of Mormon. The challenge with translating it back then was, I was in Jordan and the scripture team is in Salt Lake. I translated non-scripture, and non-scripture was closer. They were in Germany. And in those days, we didn't have email. Email didn't get approved in the church until 1996 or 97. We weren't allowed to use it. I remember the day they gave us a program called GroupWise to send emails. It was like the greatest thing in the world, because we could finally dispense with sending DHL or UPS packages from the United States to Jordan back and forth. So I would translate a segment of the Book of Mormon, and it would, I'd have to go to the DHL office, ship it to the US, and 2 months later receive a sheet of paper with, corrections on it or ideas or comments. So we translated the Arabic. The retranslation project was started in 1995, lasted for about 2 years, and we were able, given how slow the process is, to make it all the way to Second Nephi. And then they decided, we're stopping this because we need more resources for Eastern Europe. Now, just to give you a little more context about why this was so difficult, in 1992, Elder Boyd Packer was in charge of the translation committee for the church. And that's when he made the decision we need to actually standardize the way everything gets translated in the church. And that's where the whole formal equivalence process was chosen. And, there is this manual, it's about 500 or 600 pages that you, as a translator for the church, has to read. That's what you get trained in. It's basically how to deal with words, the need to have two different words that can mean the same thing, has to have two different translations if possible, absolute faithfulness and obedience to a word list. You have to basically decide which Bible you're going to use in your language. That Bible becomes the starting point for all the terminology. And it's a very detailed, it's ingrained in me now, but at the time I remember just going through that manual and thinking, Lord, help me, how am I going to do this? And so basically we start doing, and all of us were new to it. Translation supervisors were new to this. I was new to this. The people reviewing were new to this. So it took us time. So in 97, late 97, they decided we're going to stop it. We need resources in Eastern Europe. So when I came back to the US, it still took them 12 years. By 2011, the retranslation of the Book of Mormon was done in all major languages. So if you pick up a Book of Mormon in French, Italian, German, Spanish, and many of those languages, those are different. Those are new translations, and they are different than the ones people used, before 1992. And so they decided, okay, Jabra is here now. We're gonna resume the translation. So we started in 2011 and 2012, early 2012, and again, the guidelines were still there. Now, that was the history of it. The actual translation process. I mean, one thing that shocked me with it, because when you're translating, you have to keep all kinds of considerations in your mind. You have to think about your target audience. So you have to go back in your head. You have to think, this person or this family that I know in Jordan is going to be reading this. Will they understand it? Will they appreciate it? Then you have to think of all that 5, 6, I think it's 700 pages now, that translation manual. You have to think of all the things that you have to follow. And then you have to look at the paper and you say, okay, here is this expression. I mean, just from the very first verse, I was born of goodly parents. And you read the word goodly, and it has a footnote that is 20 lines long about how to translate the word goodly. And then you have to go through all of these Arabic dictionaries and say which one of these I mean, you give me goodly parents in this context of this conversation, I'll say, yeah, ولدت لأبوين صالحين. But is that word صالحين good? Does it meet all the requirements that are in that footnote? And that's what governs your translation. And then you might choose a word based on that, but then the reader, your reviewer, might say, I don't think that it meets this definition. And so you have to go back and you have to make sure you two agree on the meaning of that word, the way that word was translated. And then that word goes to another reviewer who would read it and say, no, I prefer the first one. And then you have to go through that discussion all over again. And then when you're finished with the translation, like what's just happened, and like what happened 4 years later, you're finished, you and your reviewers have agreed on everything, that book has to go to the Ecclesiastical Review Committee, which consists of members who live in area, who are leaders, who are either branch presidents or Relief Society presidents or young women, men or men presidents. And we don't have those anymore. But anyway, you go and you have people like that have to read it, and they have to give their feedback. And that feedback might destroy everything that you've done, and you go back to square zero. And so that is the translation. It's a translation by committee, that I have to say it's designed in, translation Hades. So, but so the thing about it is it's not very simple. And it doesn't end up always where you want it to be. For example, one big discussion we had in the translation is the condescension of God, that verse. And so in Arabic, in the scripture, in the Bible that we approved, it's called the Approved Bible. So for many, many decades, it was the Smith Van Dyke translation of the Bible. And now it's the Kitab al-Haya translation, which is a very popular translation of the Arabic Bible in the Middle East. I personally don't like it, but they did the survey, and members in the area said, basically, that's the one we like. And who am I to say to members, this is wrong. So we went with Kitab al-Haya. But in Kitab al-Haya, condescension of God is literally translated as basically, I don't know how to say this politely. It's basically, deity going to the bathroom. That's the way it comes across. And it's accepted by Catholics and Protestants. It's just, the way they read it and the way they understand it. And to be honest, when I read it, I'm very flexible. I believe language is a very flexible thing. It's an amazing device, and you can make of it what you want. I'm not a stickler for words, but that one I could not stand for. And I had to raise a huge ruckus in order for them to go back to, the original one, which is, used by many Protestant sects, that's used by many Orthodox sects, which is literally the condescension of God, Tanazul Allah. So that's what we went back to. But it's so when people say it does it, the Book of Mormon, is it easier to translate in Arabic or Hebrew? No, it's not, because you have all of these organizational restrictions on the translation that makes it, a very hard thing to do, but also because the more I dug into the Book of Mormon, the more you see something, and it's something you don't see it when you read it. Nobody would see it when they read it unless you're studying the text and deconstructing the text. And that's what you do in translation. You have to deconstruct and reconstruct the text, in a faithful way. When you deconstruct the Book of Mormon, you're working with these words and phrases and all these lexical items. One of these things that you notice is that the style, and I don't know, I haven't put words to it. Like I haven't, in 10 years, I haven't found a way to express this in a clear way. But when I was translating first Nephi and second Nephi, you could tell that there is this one person writing this content. And then when some other voice speaks, like Jacob or Lehi, or you notice a switch in the register almost immediately. And then you go to Enos, for example. You notice a complete switch in register again, like there is another person. And as an interpreter, you have a keen sense of that. When different people translate, they have a certain cadence in their words that is different. So you notice all of these differences in personalities and differences in language styles and differences in expression. And you notice it more keenly in the translation work that we do, because we use software, we use translation databases in translation. So you don't sit before like a word process. Excuse me. It's not like you sit with a word processor and you're typing a translation. You have the system and you're looking at the English segment, and then you're putting the Arabic in, but then there is all of the notes from translation showing up. Then there is things that make sure that you stay consistent with how you translated something. And so you're working with a lot of things that actually deepen the process of deconstruction for you. So, for example, when I made the big switch from the small plates and went into Alma, I was like, oh my gosh, we've translated a big portion of the Book of Mormon. So now every translation decision I've made before is already encoded in the system. And so when I go to Alma, much of these phrases and expressions that I've used before are going to repeat. The computer is going to fill it out for me and I will translate it faster. But that's not what happened. You go to Alma, and none of the translation decisions you've made before is relevant. Almost all of it was irrelevant because the expressions, that cadence does not repeat, and you're starting blank slate again. And I remember spending, I don't know, a year to translate Alma. It took me a year. And I just kept going back and forth, and I was making all of these new decisions. So I finished Alma, and I'm like, great. This is the bulk of the Book of Mormon. Now we're in, we're in the tail end of this race. And you go to Helaman. And again, none of the translation decisions is relevant. And when I say that, I mean the computer isn't pulling up any of the phrases. Like you'd think some things would repeat. If so, for example, if I write a document and you're the translator and you're required to translate it, and you have a database of everything I've written before, there are certain expressions that I love to use and I love to repeat. It's what I'm familiar with, and those would repeat. And so the computer, if you're translating with a translation database, it would pull up those phrases already translated for you in the box, and all you have to do is just put in the new words. And you'd think by the time you finish translating Alma, that there is a big chunk of the Book of Mormon has already been translated. Your translation decisions will, those phrases and things will start pulling in again, and you'll be filling blanks. Nope, that's not what happened. You're always translating something new. And because it is a different person, it's one person abridging the whole thing. But I think when the Book of Mormon was abridged, he preserved that uniqueness of the different writers who are involved in the process. So if Joseph Smith was the translator of the Book of Mormon, what you'd expect when you're using a translation database is that Joseph Smith, because this is something that no human can do, which is to translate it or write in a unique style every time you're doing something or writing a new document. You'd expect Joseph Smith to write in the same way he wrote Nephi, to write Alma in the same way he wrote Nephi, in the same way he wrote Helaman, in the same way he wrote Moroni, etc., etc. And it doesn't work like that with the Book of Mormon. Every book is unique, and some chapters within each book are unique, and the translation decisions don't repeat. The translation the translation blocks do not repeat. So to me, when I was working on it, it was to me sort of as close as you would get to a scientific proof that this person, my PhD and my master's degree involved doing a lot of statistics. And to me, that was like a statistical proof, a corporal linguistic statistical proof that the Book of Mormon was not written by one man. It wasn't even it was abridged by one man, but that one man who abridged it preserved the styles of the different people who were involved that he was abridging. If Joseph Smith was writing that book, if he's the one who wrote that book, then I would have expected the job to be like the computer would have made the job so easy, because it would pull those similar paragraphs and styles and phrases all the time for me. And I wouldn't have had to make as many translation decisions as I did. But yeah, it was really, by the time I was finished with it, it was extremely interesting. And it was put in like that was confirmed to me when I started working on the Doctrine and Covenants. The Doctrine and Covenants was an easier book to translate. It took me almost 2 years, not quite, but almost 2 years, as opposed to 4.5 for almost 5 years for the Book of Mormon. The Doctrine and Covenants took 2 years because the voice is the same there. Many of the phrases and lexical units repeated. So you could tell that this is the voice of one person speaking. This is the product of one mind doing it, as opposed to the Book of Mormon. I don't know. Do you think that's clear? Do I make the point clear to you?
Yeah, those in the chat say that yeah, it's actually helping them have a better appreciation of how Joseph did it. So yeah, I mean, when you mentioned like there'd be like say a footnote, like say just the term godly, it kind of reminds me of the debate. Like, does it mean morality or does it mean like say whether they're rich or not? And that's
Yeah.
a debate. So yeah,
Yeah, so we basically have all of these. We've had extensive language discussions about single words. You'd send, for example, so we talked about condescension, we talked about goodly parents. I mean, for example, within the Book of Mormon itself, when you talk about prayer, there are certain prayers that are prayers, but then there are certain things where you can't use the word prayer. I mean, in English it says prayer, but in Arabic, do you go with the word dua or not? Now, it's so, and I don't know, maybe you have a better idea than me about where it all started, like this perception that because of the origins of the Book of Mormon, it would be easier to translate into Hebrew or Arabic. But again, the Book of Mormon is a Semitic book because of the underlying culture in it. There are things in there that are absolutely, as someone who grew up in the region, as someone who's grew up by goodly Arab parents, I know that these things are, yeah. I mean, Joseph Smith couldn't have thought of them on his own. But linguistically, no. Linguistically, the Book of Mormon is unique. I think it's a product of Reformed Egyptian. I think it's a product of whatever the Nephites did to the language, and that gives it its own uniqueness. There are things, in Alma, and I have my journal, my Book of Mormon translation journal in the hard drive. I wish I had time to pull it up, but I remember journaling about this, and there were some things, like some very frustrating days, because I couldn't figure out just one verse, like how to structure it correctly in Arabic in order for it to be understood by Arabs. Like, it's Arabic is a very flexible language. So, you have languages that are subject, object, verb, and Arabic is kind of verb, so فعل فاعل مفعول به. So it's verb, subject, object. So Arabic is a VSO language, as opposed to, SOB language. And mostly, but there were times where you had to reverse that order. Like, there are some verses in the Book of Mormon where the meaning won't be clear unless you have the object in the beginning. That would, and that would emphasize the doctrinal meaning. But then you present it that way to an Arabic speaker, to the Ecclesiastic Review Committee, a member of the ERC, and they would say, no, we can't accept that because it just sounds foreign to us. And so you had to just get a special permission and say, well, target reader is having difficulty with this, and so we have to just reverse it. We have to just put it in a natural order for this person to understand it. And our ERC had people from across. We had a Palestinian, we had a Lebanese, we had a Jordanian, we had a Yemeni person. So you're covering the most of the major dialects spoken in the region, and they all had certain difficulties with the way things were translated and with the English source too. So anyway, I mean, to me, I'm an applied linguist. I'm not a theoretical linguist. To me, as an applied linguist, just seeing the differences in the Book of Mormon, the differences between in writing style between the different parts of the Book of Mormon, to me, and confirmed by the software, confirmed by the databases, to me is a testament that it could not have been written by one person. I know many people have done like all of kind of corporal linguistic studies, statistical studies, and word frequencies in the Book of Mormon, and trying to say, oh, this is the style of one person, the style of another person. I think those studies are kind of faulty because you can't just take, and I don't know, even remember what they concluded, but you can't approach the Book of Mormon if you're going to study the style like that. You have to approach it from a lexical unit perspective and say, this lexical unit, does it repeat? Because writers usually repeat lexical units. You repeat, you have certain expressions and phrases that you say in different ways, and if those repeat for any writer, and somehow in the Book of Mormon they don't repeat that often, so that to me was actually the only things that repeated in the Book of Mormon that were filled out by the translation software were when scriptures were quoted. Like, for example, in Isaiah, Isaiah was immediately populated with Isaiah, and but even there were some minor changes. So one thing, for example, your viewers might find interesting is that the translation policy for the Isaiah chapters, anything that was, King Jamesy, you had to basically go to the approved Bible and use the approved Bible. But for the Arabic Book of Mormon, we made a decision that we will treat, and I think now they applied that in most translations. What the decision was is you treat the Book of Mormon as the source, as the source for those quotes from Isaiah. So you approached Isaiah with a blank slate. You go back to the approved Bible and you say, okay, here is how they dealt with it. But you look at the English and you say, where the English differs, I'm gonna defer to the English translation. I'm going to translate from the Book of Mormon directly those different parts. So, but those were the only things that the translation database pulled in. Those were the items that repeated. And so, every once in a while when Alma talks about the brazen serpent, that part would populate, things like that, but minor. But the major things were always unique.
Yeah, thanks for that, because I actually was about to ask you about the Isaiah text itself.
Yeah.
Because I've seen some bootlegged, attempts to translate the Book of Mormon, and sometimes what they would do is like get the BHS text and just copy and paste the BHS instead.
No.
And it would trigger myself and a friend when we were looking at like some of the variants, like C versus Red C and Second Nephi 9:1 and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
No, you have to translate the English in the Book of Mormon and just preserve that uniqueness, because that's one thing that Sami Hanna did, is he went to the Smith Van Dyke translation and he basically cut and paste the Isaiah chapters from Smith and Van Dyke, and he didn't preserve the unique parts in the Isaiah quotes in the Book of Mormon. So we preserved those in the Arabic translation.
Good.
And so it's really interesting. It was really interesting because we labored on that decision for a long time before we committed, because we would go and we didn't like my supervisor and my reviewers didn't like how the approved Bible dealt with it. And we deliberated, and then we went to Elder Holland about it. And we went to our supervisor who went to Elder Holland, and he said, apparently, no, you use the English as the source and you preserve the unique parts in the Book of Mormon. Do not cut and paste from the approved Bible.
Because there are like some, even sometimes when they're small, there are significant differences.
Yeah, very small but significant differences that add to the meaning.
Yeah.
So yeah, and again, I wish I should have thought of this pulling up my translation journal, because I pointed them out. And I'm not someone with great memory. I'm more about meaning and understanding. I don't memorize a whole lot of things.
Yeah, but
But
like
yeah,
some that come to mind would be like, say, the Isaiah 9 quote, it's not like the sea, it's actually Red Sea. Red is
Red Sea,
entered.
yeah,
Or when Jacob is quoting like Isaiah 51, and said like these two things is actually these two sons. And that has significance as well for
yeah,
eschatology vis-a-vis Isaiah and the Nephites.
exactly. And those were preserved, and to add a little layer of complexity to what you just said about the Red Sea. I mean, you know that in Hebrew it doesn't exactly say Red Sea,
Reed
right?
Sea, yeah.
It reads Sea, and so we had to think: do we want to preserve it? Do we want to look at the Hebrew and take from the Hebrew? And the decision came in: no, don't use your Hebrew knowledge to impact the translation. Look at the English words and translate the English words. We were forbidden, unfortunately. I mean, and it's not a book you can footnote, and that's why I'm thinking of like producing my own translation with footnotes of the Book of Mormon in Arabic. But yeah, there are all kinds of decisions, but that was one of the decisions that were made kind of a few months after we started, which is, once we started encountering Isaiah, do not use your knowledge of Hebrew or other commentaries about these points. Just work with the English as your source text.
That's interesting. So in the Arabic, it's actually Red Sea, literally translated, not like sea reeds.
Yeah, it's not translated as Sea of Reeds with the Red Sea. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Which to me was a hard decision, because I'm a subscriber to the Reed Sea and to the Hebrew, and I listen to daily to rabbis using Rashi, and how the rabbis are about the scriptures. There is a whole layer of things there, and they have their own interpretations, and sometimes they add.
As someone who's read the Talmud and various Targumim and stuff like that, it's like the joke, which it's actually reality. Two Jews, 10 opinions, or
Ten
whatever it is.
opinions. Yeah, I know exactly. Two Jews, 10 opinions. Well, it's usually three, but yeah, 10 is more like it. 10 is more accurate. But I love it. There is, and here is the thing that I also realized, because at the time I was doing the translation, it was the beginning of my Hebrew studies phase, where I was getting into studying Rashi, studying the rabbis, and studying the Talmud. And I realized something very important about the Book of Mormon, which is that the Book of Mormon, what Nephi, what Lehi, what Mormon, what Alma, what all of them were trying to do, they were producing Torah. They were producing Torah. So if you notice the cadence of the Book of Mormon, there is an exodus, there is escaping from a tyrant, there is destroying that tyrant, there is rebellions in the wilderness, there is there is going to a promised land, there are battles, there are moral decisions that you have to make about those battles. So there is all kinds of things that in the Book of Mormon that basically mimic the stories of the Torah. there are people like Moses, we have Alma who goes and disappears, the Lord takes him away. And we have all kinds of things. So I realized the Book of Mormon is is basically was meant to be the Torah for these people. Especially, I mean, the beginning story is all about, in the beginning, they go through all of this effort to go get the brass plates back. They wanted to have a Sefer Torah with them. They wanted to have the foundational text with them, because you can't, as a Jew, you have to have a minyan. You have to have 10 people to be able to have a group prayer, but you also need to have, as a unit, you need to have your Sefer Torah. You need to have that book with you. So all of these things made me realize the Book of Mormon is the Nephites' Torah, or expansion on the Torah. And then I realized something when I did the Doctrine and Covenants. And actually, so this year I have this Facebook page, Jabra's Gospel Thoughts, and I started writing a commentary on the Doctrine and Covenants. It's sort of my literary commentary, so to speak, on the Doctrine and Covenants, because it's a book that I think is underappreciated by the church. We, go through it every 4 years, and we go through the stories, and we're focusing on the pioneers, and we're focusing on the challenges of the early saints. But what we don't see in it is that the Doctrine and Covenants itself is the Torah for our times. There are stories of Exodus there. There are stories of, going away from tyrants, moral instructions. We even have the Ten Commandments restated in there. And so we're having this expansion. I mean, as someone who studies the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Torah and Rashi and all of these people, you probably know this. The word Torah means teaching, and it means an expansion. So when two Jewish rabbis or two Jews studying, they say, teach me your Torah. So the Torah is in a state of expansion all the time, right? And I look at General Conference as an expansion in the Torah. The ideas, the messages from the First Presidency and the 12 and the Liahona are that. So we're always expanding. But the Book of Mormon is a Torah. We even have the building of a temple in there. I mean, we have all the elements that were found in the 5 books of Moses in the Book of Mormon. And that's something I realized, after translating it. It's the Nephites' Torah.
Just one question someone asked on the chat, and I think it's rather interesting. In the Arabic, how was the term faith translated, and is there a particular nuance to it?
The term
faith. Because as you know, faith in, like, say, the New Testament, it's pistis, but it's not something like believing in something, like it's like covenantal fidelity and stuff like that, faithfulness.
Faithfulness. Yeah, so faith and faithfulness are very interesting, because there is one word for faith, which is iman. But here is where it gets interesting. So, Arabic, like Hebrew, is a language that depends on a root, and there are certain meters that you have to apply to those roots to form new words. So we have about 1,600 roots, and from those 1,600 roots, the whole Arabic language is formed. So when we talk about a word like faith, everyone agrees that faith means iman. We say iman. And it's from the root amana, alif mim nun, which means, one of its meanings is security. So you're secure. When you have faith, you're secure. Also, the root means trust. So you're trusting in something. But then here is when we were talking about that word in particular, and this is a discussion 30 years ago, so my memories of it are kind of blurry. But we considered another root, which is aqada, and the word i'tiqad. Okay, so the word i'taqada, the problem I had with it is on one hand, it means the root means to tie something up, or to tie a knot. You say aqada. But it also means, it can mean, there is some doubt about what you believe in. So, for example, in everyday Arabic nowadays, in modern Arabic, you say "ana a'taqid," and it can imply that I think, with a certain degree of certainty that something is so. But when you say iman is security, is trust, it's knowing, it's more sure knowing, and that's the word we use there now. So when we were discussing the title for Doctrine and Covenants, that we had to think of, how will you translate doctrine? What's the word for doctrine? And right now, the title of the Doctrine and Covenants is Al-Mabadi' wal-Uhud, which translates literally as principles and covenants. And I wasn't in on the decision when, it was made back in the 80s, why they chose that word, because the better translation for that would be Al-Aqa'id wal-Uhud. When you say something is aqidah, it means you believe in it, but it's also malleable, it can change. And that would be my preferred translation for Doctrine and Covenants, because, we have doctrine in the Doctrine and Covenants, we have revelations, but those revelations were changed. So we have a revelation in plural marriage, then we have a revelation that says, okay, we're no longer doing plural marriage. So we're sure of it until a certain point of time, but then you want to leave room for it to change later. So that's why you would use that root aqada, which can be used for faith, but we don't use it, to translate the word doctrine, which is aqa'id. So so for faithfulness then, and this, I'm glad your viewer, very smart, that he asked this question, because we come to a word like faithfulness. So you say, oh, faithfulness. So we need to come up with a word based on iman to translate the word faithfulness. But we don't use iman for faithfulness. We use the word ikhlas. We use the word that means devotion. It means that you're loyal to something. Actually, the literal translation is loyalty. So when we talk about faithfulness, we talk about ikhlas. And for a while, we were even debating the word ikhlas, or do we use a word like iltizam, which means commitment, because they kind of, an Arab mind would look at both, and from English, and would say ikhlas, iltizam. But then when you're making a translation decision, and we're going, what I'm explaining here is the same kind of thing we talk about when we're discussing translation. Would say, okay, we have ikhlas and iltizam, but here ikhlas, why do I prefer ikhlas? Because ikhlas means I'm giving my whole, because that root khalasa, and I apologize, two of these letters do not even exist in English, but khalasa means I am coming to this conclusion about something, this is the essence of something, and I'm committing to it. And so we use ikhlas. So when we talk about, for example, a faithful wife, we say zawja mukhlisa. We say she's faithful because everything about her is committed to that relationship that she has with the husband. Or we say, again, a faithful husband, we say zawj mukhlis. So basically we decided we're going to use ikhlas for faithfulness. We're not going to go with the root for iman. We're going to use this word for it. So there is all kinds of things. I mean, in the age of Chat GPT and Google Translate, you have many translators who would basically say, oh, I'm going to put a talk, or I'm going to put this part of scriptures into some of these platforms and have it translate for me. But translation is nuanced, especially when you're translating doctrine. You have to really think of the consequences of the words that you're committing to paper, because these words are going to be read by someone, and he's going to form a whole world of religious opinion based on how you translate that word. So during conference we had this discussion about, yeah, ChatGPT is going to replace everyone here. You hear some of the brethren saying ChatGPT is better than the people translating the languages that they know, and I'm like, no, actually, if we truly value the words, if we truly value the doctrine, we wouldn't even entertain having ChatGPT or having Google Translate do that, because there is an element of human decision making and nuance that goes into these things that artificial intelligence isn't even there yet. I don't think it will be there. It can give you a starting point. It can give you some words to look at and say, okay, what do I think of this? But most of the time, and trust me, I work with ChatGPT and AI a lot for my work, but almost always you have to do an immense amount of modification to translation, because you have to take these words and you say, how are these going to be read? How do they impact the person who receives them? What is he or she going to understand from this? And you have to weigh all of these things, and then you commit to the words on paper. That is translation. That is translation for you.
No, that's good because you probably are familiar with the book by Brent Schmidt from BYU Idaho. He has a very good book on pistis, or faith and integrity, where he goes
No,
through the.
no, unfortunately not, but I'm going to look it up.
Well, he's given me permission to share PDF, so I'll send it to you afterwards.
Oh,
So
good. Okay. So that's super.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. So I'll send it to you on Facebook after this. But no, that's been really good. Let me just see if there's any other questions in the chat. No, but I think that's been pretty good. Like we've discussed Nelson Oaks, the church in the Middle East, and the Arabic translation. So in closing, like say, any other thoughts you want to share, and like if anyone wants to get into contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
Okay, so just some final thoughts. So I think we've had an amazing run with President Nelson. I think but not just the last 7 years. I think people will be studying and contemplating and will be affected by the life of President Nelson for generations to come in the church. I think he's achieved some significant things even before he became a prophet, as I said. But now I think we are at a stage, and I really, really pray that President Oaks will be given a long life, enough to accomplish his mission. I yesterday, okay, I'm not gonna say this to brag or anything, but yesterday I had lunch with, it followed the legal symposium, and I had lunch with Elder Bednar, who sat with me on the table, and next to me was President Oaks. And we were like 3 feet away from each other, and I watched him closely. He gave an amazing talk about religious freedom, and it was amazing to me to see. And I've seen it, like when we interpret, they give you like a close-up of each of the speakers, and it's really interesting that you see there is this period. And some people might say, oh, this is your cognitive bias, this is just because of your faith. So be it, but I'm going to have to say it. You see the mantle descending on these people. You feel it in their voice, you feel it in their speech, you feel it in the way they present. You just feel it. And I felt it with President Nelson when he became the president of the church. He was a completely changed man. I think the last talk he gave before becoming president was about the Book of Mormon. I'm not sure about that though, but I remember, the feeling I had interpreting that talk, and then his first talk as prophet. And it's just the shift that happens, the authority of it. And again, might be a cognitive bias, but you see it. And Elder Oaks yesterday, and I've never been that close to a prophet during a period like this. I've seen the shift. I've seen, you could feel the energy that came from him. And I think we're in for a very interesting time with President Oaks, no matter how short or long it will be. And I pray it will be long. But you could see it. You could just see it on him. I would almost see, and people who are not members of the church would probably mock this or would think it's weird, but you could see, I could see literally light, a halo on him, descending on him. It was just an amazing experience to me. So we're in for an amazing period. I think he's the prophet sent to us at the right time, and he is in the right place. He has the right thinking, the right doctrine, the right set of skills to take us through this time. The other thing is, whoever listens to this, just be aware of Arabic speakers, whether they be, whatever you meet them. We're, you won't believe Arabs when they come to Europe or come to the Western world where they kind of have some freedom, they become more receptive to the doctrines that we teach and to our church. I've spent, like yesterday again, as a part of that event, I was with a high level official from the region of Kurdistan in Iraq. And, we take them in a tour, and we show them different things that the church does, especially in humanitarian assistance. And I've been doing this particular symposium for 13, 14 years, and I've taken many, many, many delegates, Muslims mostly, through, these tours. And I have to tell you that people are always impressed with the restored gospel. They might not agree that Jesus is the Son of God, that he's our Savior, or any of those doctrines, but the gospel in action opens a door into their heart, and it melts all resistance. It's like magic. I mean, the person I was with yesterday is the top ecclesiastical Muslim leader in Kurdistan. He's like their minister of religion. He and his wife were there, fully observant, uh, and his heart was melted as we showed him the things that we do. And then in the end, they usually read a quote by Joseph Smith about, charity, and he was like, this is amazing. This is very similar to what we teach. And so share the gospel with, don't be hesitant, just be a good member around Arabs, around Muslims, around Arab Christians. Present the church to them. Don't be afraid to share the church's teachings with them. And if you want to contact me, because I'm always happy and willing to help or guide people to resources or interpret or anything, especially if you're missionaries in an area where there is Arabic speakers, you can contact me on, so there is a page on Facebook that I do. It's called Jabra's Gospel Thoughts. And I'll share it with you, share the link to it. Maybe you can share it on your stream or something. But you can always contact me there, and or you can go on Facebook, and I have a public page. You can just drop me a line in Facebook Messenger. I'd be very, very happy to hear from you.
That's perfect. What I'll do is on the show notes, I'll include a link to that Facebook page.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we're actually out of time, but again, thanks for coming on, and really do appreciate that. So,
thank you. Wow, good times fly fast. We're almost 2 hours. I can't believe it. It didn't feel like it.
It was fun, but yeah, hopefully we can do something else again sometime. But until then,
Yeah,
thanks for coming on, Jabra. I really do appreciate it.
you're welcome. I really appreciate it, Robert.
And also do the books later.
Oh, what? Yeah, I would love to see that. Thank
Perfect.
you.
Take
Yeah,
care.
you have a wonderful